This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, welcome to Undistracted. I'm your host, Laura Bennett, and this is the podcast where we learn from our guests how to be better at building our lives with intention around our passions, our purpose, and deal with some of the stuff that gets in the way of it. Do you ever feel uneasy with the state of your life? Maybe you've become a bit disconnected, no longer inspired by what used to light you up, or thinking, I'm not sure this is me at my best. Who have I become? Creator of Millennial Therapist, where she has over 1.5 million followers, Sara Kuburic is an existential psychotherapist. She was born in Yugoslavia, raised in Canada, and is passionate about helping people seeking change to live authentic, free, meaningful lives. Her interest in psychology comes from her personal experience living through wars, navigating complex relationships, and continually learning what it means to be human. In her first book, It's On Me, she helps us identify self-loss, that feeling of being estranged or disconnected from our true self, so that we can answer the big questions about who we are and how to live accordingly. Let's welcome Sara to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I do feel like when I read this, you were reading my diary just a little bit. There's a lot of things in this that are really relatable as you bring up this idea of self and authenticity and those times where we can sometimes feel a little bit disconnected from who we are and our identity can feel a little ruffled. Before we jump into some of the concepts you do raise in It's On Me, what was your experience like of self-loss and losing your own sense of identity?
Yeah, I think when you look at someone who writes a book, it's fascinating how many times they write about something they've experienced. And that was definitely the case for me. I think in my early 20s or early mid 20s, from the outside, I looked like I had it all together. I was, competitive in grad school. I was married. I was contributing to my community. I was doing all the right things. And I felt incredibly broken. I felt incredibly unfulfilled. I felt like I woke up one day and realized that the life I was living was not my own, that I didn't want it. And worst of all, I realized that the person that I was a complete stranger to me and that I had no idea who she was. And I think that that was an incredibly disorienting and frightening experience that then led to a full-on panic attack.
Do you think that sense of disconnection from who you were, who you'd become, was that a gradual sort of change in you, a growth? Like essentially you had grown out of the identity that you had initially started creating for yourself with some of those things?
Great question. Yeah, I absolutely think it was gradual. I almost think it appears accidental. It wasn't, because I think in my book I talk a lot about how every choice we make creates an authentic or inauthentic version of ourselves. But I don't think I deliberately or consciously even fully understood how I was growing apart. And I think what makes my case a little more complicated is the fact that when I was young, I went through something that was quite traumatic. And so instead of, progressing in this like self-awareness phase and self-expression phase, I was in survival for a really long time until my mid-20s. And that's when I realized I was so lost. And so I think the early childhood trauma definitely made it a little more difficult for me to be like, I had an established sense of self. And then I kind of strayed away. I feel like I never fully established my sense of self.
Yeah, and it's probably something that continues to change as we go through life. But you mentioned it was really a panic attack that it all sort of culminated in. What happened with that?
Yeah, so I was on a plane. I was with my sister in Las Vegas. It wasn't that wild. It sounds wild. It wasn't at all. Like, we don't party at all. We were just like, we wanted to go see some shows, eat some food, and like be by a pool. That was it. And we were flying home through LA. And what happened was, I think I realized I was going home to the life I didn't want. I had like the oasis of like 10 days without it. And I think the thought of going home, my body was like, you really need to do something about it. And as I was like fastening my seatbelt, I just got a panic attack, and I don't even remember fully how I got off the flight, and then I lost function of my arms and speech, and it was a really scary experience, but I think it just showed me how much my body was trying to communicate and stop me from living a life of self-loss.
Explain to us what self-loss is, because that'll be a new concept for some people, even though the moment you explain it, I
Yeah,
know
of
they're going to
course.
say, I have been there.
Yeah, of course. So self-loss is just being estranged, lacking alignment or congruence. It's thinking you're one version of yourself, but your actions, thoughts do not align. And another way that I kind of present in the book is the failed responsibility to be ourselves. And so it's not taking accountability for how we show up in the world and creating a version of ourselves that does not belong to us.
And this idea of being yourself, I think people will come to that concept from all sorts of different perspectives. Like our
Yeah.
culture really does talk about being your true self, your authentic self, but that can be laid in some ways with almost a selfishness, right? That it's myself
Yes.
above all others. That's not really
Yeah.
the point you're trying to make. And I want to make that clear to people.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I don't think it's about being self-centered. I think it's more about being self-accountable and self-aware. If anything, I think this book is really heavy on the responsibility piece.
Mm.
It's about taking ownership of your life and about taking ownership of every single thing that you do. And I think the way that I define it, it's like a creation, you know, creation of responsibility, freedom, and choice. And
Mm.
those are not sexy words. There is nothing indulgent about that. It's saying you have freedom, you have responsibility, and you have choices that you're going to make, and
Mm.
that's going to create who you are.
And there's a thread of empowerment in that too, I think, because even with
Yes.
this title, it's on me. Whether you're somebody
Hmm.
like yourself, who you mentioned, you've got traumatic experiences, legitimate traumas, and all of us in our own respects have a history that we come to this with. But I think you start with this idea that you are empowered in how you respond to that. You're empowered in how you take the things that may be outside of your control, but then you do something about where your life is going to go on the other side of that.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I think the concept of responsibility and choice and freedom to me is incredibly empowering. If you created the self that you don't necessarily know or like or respect, that means you have the capacity to create the self that you want to be. And I think there's something really liberating and beautiful about that. And I think, it's an ongoing process. We don't figure out who we are and then we're like going to a closet, pick out a sweater, put it on, and then we're done. It's an ongoing thing that you get to try and tweak and adjust, and it's okay for it to be messy and confusing. I think it's just about living with intention.
Intention is something I love talking about on this podcast, about how we do.
Mm.
Yes, there are things we can't control, but there is certainly an intentionality we can bring to how we do our daily life and the choices we do and don't make. From your perspective, what are the sorts of things that we do day to day that really do define who we are and what we as our individual selves become?
Remember once posting on Instagram being like, every decision you make, big or small, is creating who you are. And I remember someone in the comments being like, calm down. That's like so intense. And I had to be like, yeah, but it's true. I think that even this conversation we're having right now is going to impact me. It's going to impact the way I understand myself, the way I understand you, the way I understand the radio station. And I think everything we need to be so careful with what we consume and who we interact with and what we do. And I think something I really emphasize in the book is understanding yourself holistically in terms of like your emotions, your body, and your thoughts, and really trying to tune into these three components of yourself so that you can be more intentional and so that you can at least understand how things are or not or are not impacting you.
And it can be as simple. I like the examples you bring up in the book about the simplicity of a scene in The Runaway Bride with Julia
Yes.
Roberts, where
Yeah.
the way, and some people, the rom-com fans among us will know this, about the way that
Yes.
she interacts with every different boyfriend that she has. She has her egg a different way based on how they like it, whether it's scrambled, poached, or boiled, whatever it might be. But she doesn't know what she likes because she's never decided or had that chance to work it out.
Absolutely. And I love that scene where she finds out or figures out, it dawns on her, she doesn't know what she likes. So she's at home, she makes all these different types of eggs and she tries them. And I think so much of this process is like that. It's just trying and seeing what aligns. And I think I love what you brought up a little earlier of like some people don't have childhood trauma. And I don't think you have to have this big life event happen to you to feel a bit lost and disconnected. I actually think it happens to all of us. And so I like for her, it was maybe just getting lost in those relationships. It was getting lost in those details. It was not taking ownership of the types of eggs that she liked, to the extent that later she probably, I think it alludes to us, compromised a lot in these relationships and then figured out that she didn't really know who she was.
And then you almost in that example, like she would, I love that we're using Julia Roberts in this, but you know, that
yes,
she would,
I love it.
It's like you learn something about yourself even in that. Like I think when you have that awareness of like, oh my goodness, I've made these choices because of all of these other people's preferences. Oh, I might be a people pleaser. I might be really indecisive. Like you almost do learn something about yourself in realizing even a quality like that.
Absolutely. And you know what? No one is perfect. So the awareness is going to show you some things that you might not like to see. But I love this reframe of like, it is so helpful. It's helpful to even know like, hey, these are traits I would like to have less of. These are traits I would like to replace. I think that's a great starting point. And I think truth is hard, but what we need to understand is that ignoring the truth doesn't make it go away. So I think changing our relationship to the truth, even a hard truth, is so important to go, it's liberating, it's a direction, it's a teacher, I think can lessen some of that anxiety around like looking at ourselves for the first time and going, oh my gosh.
I don't know who I am anymore. But
I don't know who I am anymore.
And the authenticity trait that you bring up, or the definition that you bring to authenticity, I found is quite different from the one that many of us may have as we understand it. How do you view authenticity?
I mean, I feel like my boy Heidegger really helped me with that. No, I think, you know, I do rely a little bit on the philosophical lens, and that's ownership of self. And I think it's like being an author of your own life and owning your own decisions. And I think that that's a really empowering stance, but also a less self-centered stance. Again, it's not about being like, I don't want to do that because I'm being authentic, or like, I said what I said, I'm being authentic. And it's like, yeah, but are we taking ownership of how you said it and who you said it and what the context was of you saying it? I'm not suggesting you silence yourself, but I think you need to take ownership of how you are communicating what you're feeling and choosing to communicate what you're feeling. And so I think it's a bit more, again, responsibility driven as a definition.
Yeah, I really appreciate the way you do champion the connection between these conversations of authenticity of self, but also consequence and responsibility, because I do think we can get very easily skewed in the way that you put it of, you know, I said what I said and all this kind of stuff. Like I always feel like there is a need to go, yes, express yourself. Yes, make sure that you're sharing a view on things that matter to you and all of this sort of stuff, but don't be an absolute brat about it. Like, just remember that there's consideration and graciousness to other people to be had in this too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we need to understand that how you treat other people reflects who you are. And I think sometimes we have this version of ourselves that's really kind and thoughtful. And then if we are aware enough, we'll realize that we say things that are maybe not kind and not thoughtful, and that our actions have consequences. And then we have to reconcile the perception of who we think we are and how we're actually treating and impacting those around us. And I think that that's sometimes really difficult to do.
Yeah, it reminds us we all exist in community when you've got to be respectful of yourself and everybody else.
Absolutely. And I think in the book, I also talk about the fact that you can't construct your sense of self in isolation. You can't go into a cave and then emerge and be like, this is who I am.
Yeah.
Because if that worked, great. I would tell you to go find a cave. But I think the reality is that we are shaped and molded by the people around us, and we're social creatures, and we do co-construct each other. And this is why it's so important to find those people that want to see you for who you are, that want to accurately reflect, that want to support you. That part becomes so important.
Yeah.
And then we have the responsibility to be that for someone else as well. Tying that back in.
No, it's a balance. I was just gonna say, like, the importance of our social group and who you choose to have around you. It matters so much. Like, I'm sure so many people are familiar with the idea that you become the sum of your 5 closest friends. So we need to choose them wisely.
so wisely. And then also understand that you are in someone's circle and
Mm.
the responsibility of that. You're someone's five. So how do you want to impact and shape them and take responsibility for that?
Mm. And one other concept you touch on is this idea of inner consent and how we
Yes.
can. I needed to like reread some of these bits because I think you could realize the things that silently or otherwise you're either allowing or disallowing based on this kind of internal monologue of sorts. Express that better than
Hmm.
I did. How would you explain what the
No,
inner consent is?
I love it. Inner consent. I like that that's resonating with so many people. Inner consent to me is an inner yes. It's understanding and recognizing the alignment of something. It's a coming home feeling. And I think to have an inner yes, something I talk about is that sometimes you have to say no.
Hmm.
Inner consent is not just about saying yes to everything, it's knowing when to say no so that you can say yes to something else. Because every yes replaces another possibility. And so I think saying no becomes such an important part of inner consent, which I think is sometimes like a nice little twist.
Yeah, and the things that we relate those things we're saying yes and no to are often, sets of values or sets of beliefs. For somebody who's maybe struggling with some of those fundamentals, like the things that yourself is really anchored onto, how do you start to
Mhm.
establish and look at some of those things to really work out, well, if I am going to become myself, what am I resting that in?
Yeah, I love that. The foundation of values and sense of morality are so important. And I don't think people realize how tied your morality is to your identity and sense of self. And that's something I've researched for so long. And I think there's two pieces of advice I would give. One is look how you're spending your day. Write it down. What are you doing? And I think if you look closely behind each action, there will be a value. And you might not even be aware of the fact that you are living out a value. So let's say that you're video gaming and you can be really judgmental. You can be like, I'm wasting my time. I should be studying. I should be doing chores, whatever it is. I think understanding like why do I like to game? What is the value? Is it connection? Is it self-expression? Is it escapism? What is the value driving you? And we can do that with every single action throughout our day. And that can start to make our values a bit more conscious for us. The second thing is understanding who you respect and admire
Hmm.
and what values they tend to live out. And understanding that if that tends to resonate with you, try living them out. Taste those eggs. See if that sits or doesn't sit. Because I'm not saying look at someone you admire and be them, but look at someone you admire, see what values you're living out, and try it out yourself.
In doing that process, we come back to that word responsibility. You've got to take
Mm,
responsibility for the things that you are guiding your life by. If you're in a position where you feel like you don't have that kind of agency, where so much is happening to you that you don't even feel like you don't even have freedom, let alone responsibility, how do you gradually
yeah.
start to perhaps claw some of that back and take responsibility for the things that you can?
Yeah, and I think those are the toughest situations, to be honest. Like the situations where you feel like your choices are so limited, your freedom is so limited. And I think understanding that your attitude, the meaning you're creating from situations, sometimes are the only freedoms we have. And I think that can change so much for us. So let's say you're in a really crappy job, but you realize that right now that's where you need to stay. You need to provide for your family. I think choosing then your attitude towards your work or choosing to acknowledge the value behind your work. So I say, like, to my clients, I'll always discuss, like, you might not like going to the grocery store, and that will feel like life is pushing you into something you don't want. But maybe think about the fact that you go to that grocery store because you want your family to be healthier, because you want to save money. That's going to feel like a pull because that's a value.
Hmm.
And it's not just a task, which is a push. So I think sometimes really just trying to connect to those values and going, I don't like the task at hand. I don't feel like I have a choice, but what I can still choose and what my freedom is the attitude and the meaning I construct.
That is such a powerful way to look at it because so often we feel obliged, like obligation can
Yeah.
become this negative thing that forms our attitude. But we could actually change our perspective slightly, and then that takes the obligation out of it.
It can take the obligation out of it, and it can, if you can't change, yeah, if you can't change the situation, change your attitude towards the situation. I think we can find a bit of freedom and liberation in that until maybe one day we go, okay, now I can change my job. And then it is your responsibility to take those scary steps
Mm.
and change the job that you feel like is, killing your soul.
Yeah, and it's a dramatic way to put it, but it can feel so true, and it is true, right?
So true. It is true. And I think we sometimes, dismiss how much work impacts us and we talk about relationships so much. But think about how much time you spend at work. How much of your day you're spending doing, interacting with work related things. It's really serious. I do think that sometimes people feel like it is killing their soul.
Mm.
And I think we need to take it seriously. We need to be a little more empathetic when people don't like their jobs because that's a huge deal.
It's a huge thing. And as you've pointed out, you do need to put food on the table. There are times where you've just got to do the work, but there's
Yes.
got to be ways where you're not literally and maybe metaphorically killing yourself in the process.
Yeah. And, again, it's like that fine balance of find the value in what you have to do, but also take the responsibility to leave a job that maybe you don't need to be at, but you feel like it's more cushy and more
Mm.
comfortable and you're too scared to try something different and prioritize your mental health and prioritize your soul
Mm.
over the paycheck if you are in a position to do so.
Yeah. Now, this is going to be a question just because I'm going to use this as my own personal counseling
Okay.
session, but I know it's going to relate
Love
to other
it.
people. One of the points you bring up that I feel like is, I mean, I know this has been a sticking point for me, but I think it's a sticking point for many people as well. This tension between gratefulness and growth. Like there's a sense that be thankful for this thing that you have, whether that's your job, your family, the place you live, etc. But then there are times where we have a desire for more. We feel like there is a sense of something beyond our current moment. Gratefulness and growth. How do you see them going together? Because I feel like gratefulness can sometimes be a trap that stops us going on to that next thing.
Gratefulness is a tricky one. Either it can make us a bit complacent or it can also be forced on us. I feel like there's a lot of dialogue right now that's like, be grateful, practice gratefulness. And you're like, I have nothing to be grateful for. And, that's probably not true. But I also don't believe in forcing people to find gratitude in really crappy situations. I don't think that that's the answer either. I think when the way I look at gratefulness is be more aware when good things happen. Don't allow your mind to filter out all the good and only focus on the bad.
Mm.
Because then you're going to not be very happy about your own existence. So for me, it's more like acknowledge when good things happen instead of like invent and pretend and be grateful for some things you're not grateful for. But I think what that allows space for is like that self awareness and then growth. Because I think you can be grateful and want more. I think the and statements are really profound. It's like you can grieve and have relief.
Mm.
You can be excited and be scared. And I think as humans, we always think one or the other. And I think with a sense of gratitude and awareness, growth is probably more possible for us.
Mm.
And it comes from a safer space because we're grateful for so much and look at all these things working out. And I know that I can do more. And so I think it's just our human minds, like training them to hold two things that seem like they're in contradiction, but they're not.
That is so helpful. That is the bit. I'm just take notes, write this down.
Perfect.
Appreciate it. But when we look at just how much agency we do have in our lives, whether it's a little bit or a lot, and we try to develop that, do you also think that society, the cultures that we grow up in, really do affect whether we're in a position where we're feeling totally disconnected from who we are, or whether we also then on the flip side feel like we can absolutely be, whoever we are, whatever we want to be?
For sure. I do think so. And even, I always think, what would have happened if I stayed in Serbia as a child? I feel like I would have been a completely different individual. And that's a really wild thought to me because of the way that, sometimes women are told that they can or can't be something. And I probably would have internalized a part of that. And I mean, I'm making crazy generalizations, but just from observations and anytime I go back, how people speak to me, I understand how that impacts me. And I think families are huge. I talk about how one of the causes of self-loss can be modeled behavior and family roles.
Mm.
And so if there's no space for self-awareness, self-expression, self-exploration, it makes it a little more difficult. If there are clear like expectations and pressures and threat of abandonment if you don't fall in line, I think you're less likely to take those steps to really figure out who you are or push back. And that's normal because it's so scary to think about losing your family.
Yeah, I think it's important the way that you highlight how sometimes we can be, depending how you grew up, we can be really good at being obedient, but not necessarily questioning in a positive way, questioning the rules or the ideas that we're being obedient to.
Yeah. And, when we think about questioning, people always feel like defiance, but it's more like evaluation, discernment, being like, this really fits. This so resonates. I really want to pass this along and I want to really lean into this idea that my culture or my family has, and then also going like, hey, this doesn't fit, let me figure out why it doesn't fit, and let me explore that with my family and try to figure out like where the compromise is, and do I feel like I'm compromising myself by saying true to this one concept. So I think it's not about denying, rejecting, resisting, breaking. I think it's more just about discerning, being honest, having those important conversations, and just being aware of how things impact you.
And it is odd to think that, because when you ask a question, the idea is that you're seeking to understand something. You're not seeking to necessarily crush something. You're like, I'm curious, I want to know more. And I would imagine that questions help us take ownership over the values that are being modeled for us or the ideas being modeled for us. If you can question it, you can understand it, you can say, yes, I want to own that for myself.
I think it deepens our conviction. It deepens our alignment. And I think when we do things without understanding why we do them, there is no alignment. So I think the questioning can be so healthy if it comes from a place of like openness and safety. And I think if all of us understood questioning more like an opportunity rather than a threat, we would have a very different society.
How do we know that we're doing this well? Like, as we look at the difficulties around self-loss, how do you know you're starting to become more well acquainted with who you truly are and the values that mean a lot to you?
One is congruence between who you think you are and how you're actually acting. That's a huge one. And I think awareness in the three areas that I previously mentioned. If you still have a really hard time identifying what your feelings are or managing them, if you're really struggling to know what your body's telling you, if you have a hard time deciphering your thoughts, I think you're going to struggle living the most authentic life. And that's okay. Like, that's okay. I think we all struggle with one of them, all three of them. I've been there. I've struggled with all three. So there's absolutely no judgment. But I think if you look at those three areas and you go, hey, I'm quite attuned to all of this, there's a much greater chance that you're living with intention and alignment than if you are completely disconnected with your mind, body, or emotions.
On this podcast, Sara, I want to ask you a question that I ask many of our guests. We talk about being undistracted, how to live your life intentionally around your passions, your purpose, how to deal with some of the stuff that gets in the way of that. For you, what would that look like? If you were going to live an undistracted life around what resonates with you, what would that life look like for you?
I feel like I'm trying to do that. It's not perfect, but I am trying to do that. And I think for me, it's like that tension of exploring, and exploring can be a bit distracting sometimes. I like that exploratory nature. But I think undistracted, I would watch less Netflix. If I had to give like a really tangible thing, and I don't know how profound usually these answers are, mine is not, I think it would be consuming less and creating more. I think that would help me be a little less distracted for sure.
So much of what Sara says is a challenge to take responsibility, to see where, even if it might be in little ways, we do have abilities to gradually shape our lives in a way that reflects who we are, our core values, the things that are important to us. But it's also a massive encouragement to just remember that if parts of your life don't feel like they suit you anymore, if there's things that feel like a mismatch, there's a way to understand that. She gives great voice to it, and there are pathways forward as well. You can see a video version of this interview on the Hope 1032 YouTube channel. I'd love to hear what you think as well. You can email me undistracted@hope1032.com.au. And until next time, enjoy living this undistracted life.
This is a Hope 1032 production. Thanks for listening.